And thank you to everyone who presented. I have gotten a few questions, but please feel free, anyone, to add more questions into the chat, and I will read them. The first question is for I-Wen, actually. It says, watching Behave, I was both impressed by artists breaking the conventional boundaries of their respective forms, but also interested in your thoughts on the artist's recourse, especially Klunchun's, the conceptual dance and contemporary arts techniques like those we see in Western postmodern dance. What do you think of this territorialization of Western aesthetics on emerging Southeast Asian dance?
I'm looking at the question and trying to find out where it is because I want to comprehend the question.
It was sent as a direct message to me. So here.
Sorry. Can you say it again? Because I was looking at the chat. The question.
It does not let me. It doesn't let me copy it and paste it into you. So I will say it again. Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Watching Behave, I was both impressed by artists breaking the conventional boundaries of their respective forms, but also interested in your thoughts on the artist's recourse to conceptual dance and contemporary arts techniques like those we see in Western postmodern dance. What do you think of this territorialization of Western aesthetics on emerging Southeast Asian dance?
Oh, that's a really good question. Because some people might say this kind of conceptual dance is still a Western adaptation or like a Western application toward the non-Western choreographers. From my perspective, I wouldn't think of the conceptual choreographic strategies as purely Western. I would say it more my personal thinking, I would say this is just a strategy that can be used for them to dealing with their own issues. So for example, actually both of the choreographers, they did a separate piece in the Taipei Arts Festival last year. And Chen Wukang is actually collaborating with Jehong Bell this time. And that piece is called Dances for Wukang Chen. And that also arose a lot of attention that critics debating about whether this is a piece that is from the Chen Wukang's own choreographic thinking, or it is another version of Jehong Bell. So it got a lot of attention. And I would point it out that from another piece by Picha Kanchu, and that piece is also performed in the Taipei Art Festival last year. It's called Number 60s. And that piece, I don't think it's ever, I don't think it's performed in Thailand yet, but it does showcase the 59 historical postures that is embedded in the cone dance and how he transformed the whole piece into a completely new dimension. I actually highly recommend that piece and how he used that piece to comment on some social issues that even taking place right now in Thailand, just like the other presenter has talked about the protests in Thailand and how he strategically used that thing and contextualized and intertwined it with the classical dance. And I thought that was really brilliant. And I wouldn't say this trial is just the copy or the plagiarizing or some sort of one dimension kind of negotiation from adopting the Western conceptual art strategies. I would say they still in itself has a lot of potential. That's my take.
Great, thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to respond to that, or? Okay, so the next question is for Sadiah and Paul, both of you. It says, thinking about the tensions of labor and capital exchange between the local and the global in the Indonesian contemporary dance, I am really interested in hearing more about what you think about practitioners making work for audiences in metropolitan centers around the world. What do you think is the local impact beyond audience reception of the works surveyed in this paper?
Sadiah. I was going to say Paul. I mean, that's obviously a tough question, right? There is not really a very straightforward answer. But if you're talking about the local impact, if we understand the local impact, the impact of the Indonesian productions on an international audience, or is it vice versa? I didn't really get that.
It's sorry, I can repeat it if you want. It's the end of it is, what do you think of the territorialization of Western aesthetics on emerging or wait, I'm looking at the wrong one. I am so sorry. Is the local impact beyond audience reception of the work surveyed in this paper?
Yeah, I think the question is referring to the locality where the works are made or the artists are from, rather than where they're presented. Yeah.
So do you, Paul, if you want to go first, that's fine.
No, I thought you might, because just so for everyone out there, Sadiah was more involved in the production of some of these works, whereas I was more of a spectator to the finished product. So I just wondered, Sadiah, if you have any, I mean, also we can't say that all the works are the same, their conditions of production are so different. But I wondered, Sadiah, if you had any reflections based on your experience of traveling to observe those works in creation that kind of like link them into the local.
Yeah, I'm not really sure if what I will say really will answer the question, but yeah, so most of the works that we're discussing have been developed with a number of development processes, both in Indonesia and in Australia, where the Australian collaborators would travel to Indonesia and spend some time there, either 1 or 2 weeks or a couple of weeks, and come back after a few months to continue the process. So I think it works sort of like different both ways, I would say. I think the Australian collaborators were brought on board to enable the works to be appealing to international audiences. And at the same time, by spending time during these production processes in Indonesia, the local culture, of course, also started rubbing off on this team. So, I think the cultural exchange or the international collaboration actually took place during those production processes, where the Australian collaborators could really get to know the Indonesian cultures and the localities where the works were created. Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure it doesn't really suffice, it doesn't really answer the question, but yeah, that's what I can say. Paul, I don't know if you want to add anything to this.
I suppose, thinking about it from the other end of the telescope, as it were, one of the things that interested us in our conversations about these works was what the Indonesian artists felt they needed to kind of tell an international, in this case, in the first instance, Australian audience, but the works were also made for touring. It just happened that they didn't generally tour because of COVID. And how much sort of local knowledge, as it were, they either presumed and didn't see the need to tell to kind of communicate through the work to audiences, or didn't want to communicate to audiences. It's a really kind of complex dynamic, because we're talking about several works with, like, I mean, as the title of the paper says, like intra-Indonesian cross-cultural collaborations, that it's not in any way straightforward for an international audience to kind of register or recognize. And so there's a kind of onus on the artist to do a fair amount of like exegesis or exposition, if that's important to them. And if it isn't, either it's because it isn't important to their work, they find a kind of like aesthetic integrity to the work that really is where those kinds of, like, cultural differences and contexts are secondary, or they simply they take them so much for granted that they're not sort of anticipating that audiences from other settings would not have them. This also fails to answer the basic original question around like labor and conditions of production. But in a sense, I suppose part of our paper is to make the case that we also can't entirely disentangle these aesthetic and methodological questions from those conditions of production questions.
Thank you. So the next question is for everyone on the panel, actually, so anyone can answer. Can the panelists reflect on how projections of audiences shaped self-conscious representations of inter-Asia by the artists involved? How were certain projected notions of an audience leading to specific inter-Asia framings?
I'm just going to jump in with a quick observation. So thinking about I-Wen's case study with Pichette, and I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the other artist. But the you know, when I think of Pichette performing abroad, which he does a lot, I think about how I feel he's pushing that frame, that kind of like standard frame of reference. You know, he's a rebel within a classical discipline. And knowing that he's pushing it one step further usually, and implicitly, not usually didactically, but always implicitly asking the audience, what am I? Who am I? What is this body? Where does it belong? Where does it not belong? Because he's spent a whole career, a whole lifetime, you know, in his homeland anyways, with people telling him what's right and wrong about everything he does. And so I love, you know, this example of how I feel that by juxtaposing two artists who are essentially doing that, they're both looking in and out of their sort of, you know, quote unquote root cultures at the same time, and providing the audience the opportunity to understand that that's actually what's happening in their own heads as audience members.
Thank you. Are there any other panel responses to this question of audience leading to inter-Asia framings? Okay, I can. I have a question that was put in for Amin, since you have not gotten the chance to answer a question yet. It says, looking back at this performance lecture, what do you think we included or excluded by using this presentation mode? And that's from Elizabeth, hence why it says we.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth, my collaborator, for that question. I think we were trying our very best to include people who would have would be very interested in the conversations about the traditional arts and also within their forms. But I think what's missing is also the people who have authority within the different forms. So, you know, people who are involved in the gatekeeping, and also not forgetting, you know, institutions who have placed us within this rubric of traditional arts. So yeah, so I would say that. And you know, probably I'd just like to respond, you know, shortly to Nia's question about you know, Malays and Islam and the form. I would say that in Singapore, you know, the problematics of being Malay as minority, and also, you know, as being predominantly Muslim, a lot of Malay people have and also within the nation state, you know, we've taken more, when it comes to the arts, a more secular stance, and so in a sense, there is reference to Islam, but not so much having to have that very pertinent conversation about the arts and the place of the arts within the Malay Muslim community. And till today, even as a practitioner, that's something that we grapple with still. Having to talk about certain forms which has a very strong religious connection or religious origins, but having to take a more secular stance in favor of a more multicultural post 9/11 environment.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone. Again, I believe we are up for time, so I will pass it back to Ryon.
Thank you so much, Adrianna, and thank you so much for all of the speakers.